What kind of person fakes being a dessert critic to bully a room full of culinary students? Karen Miller. That's who. In a small community college classroom, where the air was thick with the scent of vanilla and burnt sugar, Karen strutted in like she owned the place. Her too tight blazer strained against her frame, and her smug grin screamed trouble. She wasn't a student. Not officially. But she'd wormed her way into the baking class's final critique session, claiming she was a renowned dessert critic invited by the instructor. No one questioned her at first. Her loud voice and commanding presence silenced doubts. She tossed her hair, her eyes glinting with something cruel, and declared she'd be judging their final desserts. The students, a tight-knit group of 20-somethings chasing dreams of patisserie stardom, exchanged uneasy glances. This was their big moment, their chance to impress a real critiquer, so they thought. Karen's arrival felt like a storm cloud bursting over their sunny hopes. The classroom buzzed with nervous energy as the students presented their creations. Delicate eclairs, glossy fruit tarts, and velvety cheesecakes lined the tables, each dessert a labor of love. Karen paced like a predator, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor. She stopped at Mia's station first, a shy girl with flour-dusted glasses who'd spent weeks perfecting her chocolate mousse. This, Karen sneered, poking the dessert with a fork. Looks like something I'd scrape off my shoe. Mia's face crumpled, but she said nothing, her hands trembling as she clutched her apron. Karen moved on, tearing into Jake's lemon tart with a scoff, calling it a sad excuse for a dessert. The room grew quieter with each jab, the students' pride wilting under her words. No one dared challenge her. Not yet. But something was off. Ethan, a wiry guy with a knack for noticing details, leaned toward his friend Lila and whispered, "Have you ever heard of a critic named Karen Miller?" Lila, who'd been glaring at Karen since her first insult, shook her head. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He pulled out his phone, hiding it under the table, and started searching. Karen's performance was flawless. She rattled off jargon about mouthfeel and flavor profiles like she'd been doing it for years. But Ethan's gut told him she was a fraud. He scrolled through food blogs, critic lists, anything he could find. Nothing. No trace of a Karen Miller in the culinary world. He nudged Lila, showing her his screen. Her jaw tightened. They weren't going to let this woman ruin their day. The plan formed quickly, whispered in stolen moments as Karen berated another student's creme brulee. Lila, who'd grown up in a rough neighborhood and knew how to handle bullies, took the lead. "We need proof," she said, her voice low but fierce. "And we need to hit her where it hurts." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. Karen's ego was her weak spot. She loved the power, the attention, the way everyone shrank under her gaze. They decided to test her. Lila slipped into the supply closet, grabbing a jar of expired pudding mix from the back shelf. It was a gritty, lumpy batch, rejected by the class weeks ago for its awful texture. She mixed it with a splash of sour milk, just enough to make it rancid without being obvious, and plated it like a gourmet dessert, complete with a drizzle of caramel sauce and a mint sprig. Ethan, meanwhile, kept digging online, determined to find something concrete. Karen was halfway through insulting a perfectly good pavlova when Lila stepped forward, holding the sabotaged pudding. "Ms. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with fake respect. "We made this special for you." A challenge for a critic of your caliber. Karen's eyes gleamed with arrogance. She loved being the center of attention. Finally, something worth my time, she said, grabbing a spoon. The class held its breath as she took a bite. Her face twisted for a split second, but she forced a smile, unwilling to admit defeat. Interesting, bold, she choked out, swallowing hard. The students exchanged glances, barely hiding their smirks. She took another bite, her confidence cracking as the sour taste hit. Ethan stood up, phone in hand. "Ms. Miller," he said loudly. "Can you tell us which publication you write for again?" The room froze. Karen's spoon hovered midair, her eyes darting to Ethan. "I'm freelance," she snapped, her voice sharper than before. Ethan didn't back down. "Funny, because I checked every major food blog, magazine, and critic database. No Karen Miller. Anywhere." The students gasped, their shock rippling through the room. Karen's face reddened, her smug mask slipping. "How dare you question me?" she spat, slamming the spoon down. The pudding splattered across the table, its rancid smell wafting up. Lila stepped closer, her voice calm but cutting. "You're no critic. You're just a bully who crashed our class to feel powerful." The teacher, Ms. Harper, a nervous woman who'd been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Is this true, Karen?" she asked, her voice trembling. Karen's eyes widened, realizing she was cornered. The confrontation was electric, the air thick with tension. Karen's haughty facade crumbled as she scrambled for an excuse. "This is outrageous," she shouted, pointing at Ethan and Lila. "You're just jealous of my expertise." But the students weren't buying it anymore. Jake, who'd been quiet after his tart was trashed, stepped forward. "You didn't even know the difference between meringue and whipped cream," he said, his voice steady. Mia, finding her courage, added, "And you called my mousse grainy when it was perfectly smooth." The class erupted, their voices overlapping as they called out every inconsistency, every cruel jab. Karen backed toward the door, her face a mix of rage and panic. But Lila wasn't done. She held up the pudding jar, its expiration date clearly visible. "How's that bold flavor, Karen?" she asked, her tone mocking. The class burst into laughter, the sound chasing Karen as she stormed out, humiliated. But the story didn't end there. Ethan's online search had uncovered something unexpected, a twist that hit the class like a lightning bolt. Karen wasn't just a random bully. She was a former student who'd flunked out of the same culinary program years ago, kicked out for cheating on her final exam. She'd been holding a grudge ever since, sneaking into classes to sabotage students out of spite. The revelation stunned everyone. Ms. Harper, shaken but resolute, reported Karen to the college administration. The students felt a mix of triumph and betrayal. How could someone sink so low just to tear others down? But they weren't broken. They rallied together, vowing to protect their passion from people like Karen. The aftermath of Karen's dramatic exit left the classroom in a strange limbo. The students were buzzing, their adrenaline high from the confrontation, but a heaviness lingered. They'd exposed a fraud, sure, but the sting of her cruelty clung to them. Mia sat at her station, staring at her moose, her confidence still shaken. Jake paced, muttering about how close he'd come to believing Karen's lies about his tart. Lila, ever the firebrand, was already plotting ways to ensure no one like Karen could crash their class again. Ethan, though, was glued to his phone, digging deeper into Karen's past. The twist about her being a failed student wasn't enough for him, since there was more to her story. Something that could explain why she'd gone to such lengths to ruin their day. Ms. Harper called the class to order, her voice steadier now. "Let's focus," she said, though her hands still shook slightly. "You all worked hard on these desserts. Let's finish the critique properly this time." The students nodded, but their hearts weren't fully in it. Karen's presence had tainted the moment, and they needed closure. Ethan, still scrolling, suddenly froze. "Guys," he said, his voice low but urgent. "You need to see this." He turned his phone to show a local news article from 2 years ago. The headline read, "Local woman fined for posing as health inspector in bakery scam." The photo was unmistakable Karen, smirking in a mugshot. Her hair slightly shorter, but her arrogant expression identical. The article detailed how she'd conned several small bakeries by pretending to be an inspector, demanding free food and threatening fake violations. The classroom erupted in gasps. This wasn't just a one-off grudge. Karen was a serial fraud, preying on people's dreams for her own gain. Lila's eyes blazed. "She's been doing this for years," she said, slamming her fist on the table. "We can't let her get away with it." The students agreed, their anger fueling a new resolve. They weren't just victims, they were witnesses now, and they had evidence. Ms. Harper, regaining her authority, promised to escalate the matter to the college's legal team. But Lila wanted more than a report. "She needs to face real consequences," she said, her voice fierce. Ethan nodded, already drafting an email to the local paper that had published the article. If Karen was still pulling these scams, they'd make sure the world knew. The next day, the students gathered in the classroom, their desserts replaced with laptops and notebooks. They weren't baking today, they were building a case. Ethan had found more online, forum posts from other culinary students across the state, all describing run-ins with a critic matching Karen's description. She'd crashed at least 3 other programs, each time posing as an expert to demean and intimidate. The pattern was clear: she thrived on power, feeding off the insecurity of aspiring chefs. Lila took charge, organizing the group to compile screenshots, timestamps, and testimonies. Mia, still quiet but growing bolder, suggested contacting the other schools to warn them. Jake, who'd been researching legal options, found that Karen's actions could qualify as fraud and harassment, especially since she'd disrupted an official class. The twist deepened when Ethan uncovered a social media account under Karen's name, filled with photos of her posing at high-end restaurants, captioned with fake reviews. The comments were brutal, real critics and chefs calling her out, but she'd blocked them, curating a bubble of false credibility. One post showed her at a bakery just a week ago, gloating about sampling their entire menu for free. The students were livid. This wasn't just about their class, Anna Maria, it was about stopping a predator. They sent their evidence to the college, the local paper, and even the police, who confirmed they'd been tracking Karen's scams but lacked enough complaints to act. Now, with the students' detailed accounts and the pudding incident as a fresh offense, The authorities had a case. The confrontation with Karen had been thrilling. But this was different, methodical, deliberate, and unstoppable. The students felt a fire they hadn't known before. They weren't just fighting for themselves, but for every dreamer Karen had crushed. Ms. Harper, inspired by their determination, reached out to her network of culinary instructors, spreading the word about Karen's tactics. The classroom, once a place of vulnerability, became a war room. They worked late, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of justice. Lila, who'd always been skeptical of authority, found herself trusting Ms. Harper, who'd stepped up in a way none of them expected. Ethan, usually reserved, became the group's anchor, his research skills turning their anger into action. By the end of the week, their efforts paid off. The local paper ran a new story, serial con artist exposed by culinary students. Karen's name and photo were front and center, her scams laid bare. The article quoted Lila, who'd insisted on speaking out. She thought she could break us, but she made us stronger. The college issued a formal ban, barring Karen from campus, and the police opened an investigation into her recent activities. The students celebrated, but it was bittersweet. They'd lost time and confidence to Karen's cruelty, and their final critique had been overshadowed. Still, they refused to let her win. They rescheduled the critique, determined to reclaim their moment. The fallout from Karen's exposure rippled beyond the classroom. The students returned to their baking, but the experience had changed them. They weren't just aspiring chefs anymore, they were a team, bonded by a shared victory over a bully who'd tried to break them. Mia, once too shy to speak up, now volunteered to present her desserts first. Jake, who doubted his skills after Karen's insults, perfected a new tart recipe, earning praise from Ms. Harper. Lila and Ethan, the masterminds of the takedown, became the class's unofficial leaders, organizing study groups and sharing tips. The classroom hummed with a new energy, a mix of pride and defiance. They'd faced a storm and come out stronger, but they knew the fight wasn't over. Karen's kind was out there, waiting to prey on the vulnerable. The legal consequences hit Karen hard. The police, armed with the students' evidence, charged her with fraud and trespassing. She'd been dodging accountability for years, but the sheer volume of complaints amplified by the students' coordinated effort finally caught up with her. At her hearing, which Ethan and Lila attended, Karen looked smaller, her arrogance replaced by a sullen scowl. She pleaded guilty to avoid a harsher penalty, receiving a fine and community service. The judge warned her that another offense would mean jail time. As she left the courtroom, she avoided the students' eyes, her once loud presence reduced to a whisper. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moral one. The students had shown her that her cruelty had consequences. But the real triumph came later, at the rescheduled critique. The classroom was packed, not just with students, but with local chefs and bloggers who'd heard about their stand against Karen. The college had invited them to honor the class's resilience. Each student presented their dessert, their voices steady, their creations flawless. Mia's mousse was a hit, earning her an internship offer from a local bakery. Jake's tart won a nod from a chef who called it innovative. Lila and Ethan, who'd collaborated on a spiced bread pudding, received a standing ovation. Ms. Harper beamed, her faith in her students restored. The room felt alive, every bite a testament to their talent and tenacity. As the critique ended, Lila stood up, holding a glass of sparkling cider. "To us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We didn't just make desserts, we made a difference." The class cheered, their laughter echoing through the room. They'd turned a moment of humiliation into one of inspiration, proving that no one could dim their passion. The local paper followed up with a feature on their triumph, titled, "Students Bake Their Way to Justice." It wasn't just about Karen's downfall, it was about their rise. They'd learned to trust their instincts, stand up to bullies, and fight for what mattered. Years later, the story of Karen's pudding disaster became legend in the culinary program. New students heard it as a cautionary tale. Don't let anyone steal your dreams. Mia went on to open her own cafe, her mousse a signature dish. Jake became a pastry chef at a Michelin-starred restaurant. Lila and Ethan, now best friends, started a food blog, exposing frauds and celebrating real talent. They never forgot Karen, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of what they'd overcome. Their classroom, once a battleground, was now a symbol of resilience. They'd taken a bitter moment and turned it into something sweet, not just for themselves, but for everyone who dared to dream.